Imagine outfitting an army of 40,000 men. Now imagine telling those men to throw their primary weapons away in the first 10 seconds of combat. That is exactly what the Roman army did. Every time a Roman legion entered a battle, they threw up to 80,000 iron-tipped javelins at the enemy. And here is the craziest part. The Romans deliberately engineered these weapons to bend, break, and become completely useless upon impact. Supplying an army is hard enough, but how do you supply an empire with millions of weapons that are specifically designed to destroy themselves? To understand this massive problem, you have to look at the sheer size of the Roman world. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched from the rainy hills of Britain to the burning deserts of Egypt. Their armies did not just fight close to home, they marched deep into the unknown. A Roman general might lead tens of thousands of men into the dark, freezing forests of Germania or the rugged mountains of Spain. They were often weeks, or even months, away from the nearest friendly city. There were no trains, no cargo trucks, and no quick supply drops. In the ancient world, every single thing an army needed had to be carried on the backs of men and horses. Now imagine that massive army finally meets the enemy. The battle begins. Within the very first minute of the fight, tens of thousands of heavy iron javelins are thrown through the air. They crash into shields, shatter against armour, and bury themselves deeply in the dirt. Just like that, the ammunition is gone. If that army had to fight another battle the next day or even the next week, they had a huge problem. You cannot just order thousands of new weapons from Rome when you're hundreds of miles deep in hostile territory. So, how did they survive? How did the greatest military machine in history keep its soldiers armed when they were constantly throwing their best weapons away? The answer is surprisingly simple, but incredibly difficult to pull off. The Romans did not wait for weapons to come to them. They brought the factory with them. The secret to Rome's success was not just in their sword fighting, it was in their walking. A Roman army never travelled light. Behind the marching soldiers was a massive miles-long caravan known as the baggage train. This train was the absolute lifeline of the empire. For every single legion of 5,000 men, there were over 1,000 pack mules. These animals were loaded down with grain, tents, and of course, massive bundles of spare weapons. A single mule could easily carry dozens of heavy javelins tightly bound together. Before a major campaign, thousands of these extra weapons were loaded up and dragged across mountains and rivers. But carrying spare weapons was only half the solution. Eventually, even the mules would run empty. This is where the Roman military genius truly shines. They did not just bring spare parts, they brought the makers. Attached to every Roman legion was a dedicated unit of highly skilled engineers, carpenters, and blacksmiths. When the marching stopped and the army set up camp for the night, these craftsmen went to work. They built blazing forge fires right there in the dirt. If an army was running low on javelins, the blacksmiths worked through the night. They hammered out new iron tips and fitted them to fresh wooden shafts cut from the nearby forests. The Roman army was a crawling, fighting, moving factory. But even a moving factory needs raw materials. If you're miles away from a Roman iron mine, where do you get the metal to keep making these weapons? The answer lies in the bloody aftermath of the battle itself. As soon as the fighting stopped, the Roman soldiers did not just sit down to rest. They went straight to work. The battlefield was completely covered in twisted iron, shattered shields, and fallen enemies. For the Romans, this was not just a graveyard. It was a massive open-air hardware store. Special teams of soldiers walked across the bloody grass, pulling their bent javelins out of the dirt and tearing them out of wooden shields. They gathered up every single piece of scrap metal they could find, and they did not stop with their own weapons. If an enemy dropped a sword, an axe, or a spear, the Romans took it. All of this scavenged iron was piled into carts and dragged right back to the blacksmiths in the camp. The smiths tossed the enemy's weapons into the roaring fires, melted them down, and hammered them into brand new Roman javelins. By the next morning, the Roman army was fully rearmed, ready to attack the enemy using their own melted down swords. This ruthless recycling system kept the war machine moving across continents. It was a brilliant short-term fix. But scavenging alone was not enough to supply a decades-long war. What happened when the army was stuck in a massive months-long siege and the battlefield was locked behind unbeatable stone walls? How did millions of weapons get from the heart of Rome all the way to the edges of the known world? To supply a massive months-long siege, the Romans relied on their true superpower. It was not their swords, it was their paperwork. Long before a Roman army even marched out of the gates, a massive government-run military-industrial complex was already hard at work. Across the empire there were giant state-owned weapon factories. These were not small, quiet blacksmith shops. They were ancient assembly lines. Hundreds of workers stood in the sweltering heat, doing nothing but hammering out iron javelin heads, day after day by the tens of thousands. But making millions of weapons is only half the battle. How do you move thousands of pounds of wood and iron to an army fighting in a muddy forest 3 months away? You might think the answer is the famous Roman roads, but you would be wrong. Wooden carts pulled by oxen are incredibly slow. They also eat massive amounts of food along the way. If you load a cart with heavy iron javelins, the animals pulling it might actually eat more supplies than they are transporting. It is a logistical nightmare. Instead, the Romans used nature's highway, the rivers. The Roman military was obsessed with water. They deliberately built their largest forts and supply hubs along massive rivers like the Rhine and the Danube. Instead of dragging heavy weapons over rough mountain passes, they loaded thousands of newly made javelins onto giant flat-bottomed cargo boats. A single riverboat could effortlessly carry more weapons in a few days than 100 wooden carts could carry in a month. These ships floated right up to the edge of the war zone, dropping off endless piles of fresh javelins directly into the hands of the waiting soldiers. It was a flawless system, until the weather turned against them. What happens when brutal winter storms hit? The rivers freeze solid, and the supply boats suddenly stop moving. When winter hit, the Roman war machine faced its greatest enemy, ice. Once the massive rivers froze and the mountain passes filled with heavy snow, the endless supply of weapons completely stopped. The Roman army was suddenly trapped, totally cut off from the rest of the world. So what did a general do when his army of 40,000 men was stranded in the freezing cold, surrounded by enemies, with no new weapons coming in? He built a fortress. These were not temporary tents. They were massive winter camps made of timber and earth, designed to survive months of total isolation. Inside these walls, the Romans did something they were incredibly good at. They hoarded everything. Long before the first snow even fell, generals ordered massive stockpiles of extra javelins to be locked away in highly guarded armories. But hoarding was not enough to survive a long winter. They had to make the weapons last. This is where Roman discipline became absolutely terrifying. During a campaign, a soldier's weapons were his life, but they also belonged to the empire. If a legionary carelessly lost his javelin or broke it outside of combat, he was not just handed a new one, he was heavily fined, beaten, or even worse. Every single piece of iron was counted, tracked, and recorded by military clerks on wooden tablets. You could not just lose a weapon and hope nobody noticed, the paperwork would catch you. When the snow finally melted and the spring campaign began, the army had to march out and fight again. But because of this terrifying level of organisation and strict discipline, a Roman legion rarely faced a battle empty-handed. They survived the winter and marched back into the mud, fully armed and ready to conquer. So how hard was it to supply javelins to Roman soldiers? It was one of the greatest challenges in ancient history. The Roman military took a weapon specifically designed to destroy itself and built an entire empire around it. They solved this incredible nightmare of supply and demand not with luck, but with extreme organisation. From the moving blacksmith factories and brutal battlefield scavengers, to the massive cargo boats and strict winter hoarding, the Romans mastered the art of war through the art of logistics. They conquered the world because they never stopped working, forging and planning. They proved that battles are won with swords, but wars are won with supply chains. Thank you for watching, and if you want to keep uncovering the hidden secrets of history, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story.